This is going to go viral all across the entire internet as an instant classic. Watch this clip from today's live testimony of Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth as he testifies before House Appropriations Committee, and how Defense Secretary Hegseth calmly dismantles Minnesota Representative Betty McCollum when she tries to grill him on the cost of deploying National Guard and Marines to Los Angeles.
Put out there to defend the country and to make sure that we're not spending a lot of money unnecessarily. So testing and evaluation is going to be an important part of that. With that, I recognize Ms. McCollum.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Secretary, I plan to ask you some budget questions about the following: the cost of the Qatar plane, where the money from the Army's parade is coming from, or the National Guard deployments to the border, where that funding is coming from. I honor and celebrate the United States Army, but I'd like to know how much this parade is going to cost. I have sent the department letters on several occasions on this, and I'm still waiting for a response. But then something else happened this weekend, and it needs to be addressed. And that is the President's premature and escalatory decision to deploy not only the National Guard troops to Los Angeles, but active duty Marines as well.
She plans to ask some budget questions about the cost of the Qatar plane, where the money for the Army's parade is coming from, or the National Guard deployments to the border, and where that money's coming from. However, what she actually does is anything but, and proceeds to double down on the left's narrative, perpetuated lies and deep state agenda regarding the anti-peaceful LA riots against ICE federal law enforcement. And while we're on the topic of budget and a wise use of our money, I saved this comment to share with you from Charlie because I want to take a moment to talk about something close to my heart, making sure that we're all using our hard-earned money wisely, especially with healthcare costs climbing. I recently came across a comment from Charlie, one of our community members, that I just had to share. And honestly, we can't say enough good things about Chapter. And Charlie wrote, "I'm in my second year with Chapter, and it's been a game changer. They've saved me so much money, and their customer service is beyond amazing. They connected me with Humana at no cost to me. My ER deductible is just $120. Primary care visits are $0. Specialists are $20. And many of my prescriptions completely free. Plus, I get a $50 OTC allowance every quarter. That's $200 a year for hundreds of products, all at no cost. And there's so much more to it. You can't go wrong trusting Chapter." Hearing stories like Charlie's warms my heart. And it's exactly why my wife, Michelle, which y'all know her as Scroll Tribe, and we partnered with Chapter, and we spent countless hours searching for a way to help seniors like you fighting inflation and these rising healthcare costs. What makes Chapter special is they were founded by folks who saw their own parents being taken advantage of by confusing Medicare plans, which makes this personal. They built Chapter to cut through the noise, simplify the process, and focus on saving you money, not pushing plans that pay them the most. Chapter service is 100% free, and their Medicare experts are there to guide you to the right plan for your needs. I could share hundreds of testimonials from our community, folks who've saved thousands with Chapter's help. And it's simple, it's honest, and it's all about you. So don't wait another minute. Pick up the phone and dial 270-467-2426. Call Chapter and let their team give you the peace of mind you deserve. Because you've got nothing to lose and so much to gain.
Mr. Secretary, we're both from Minnesota. I was in the Twin Cities during the riots that followed the murder of George Floyd. Tens of thousands of protesters took to the streets for days. Governor Walz made the decision to call up the Minnesota National Guard. At no point did we need the citizens of Minnesota request that the Marines be deployed. Our state and local law enforcement, along with our National Guard, who have worked on crowd control, they were more than enough. They were more than capable of handling this situation.
So Representative Betty McCollum, a Democrat who apparently only has a 2-star review from Google or Yelp, begins by trying to build a bridge and connection of common ground by pointing out she too is from Minnesota, telling Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth that she was in the Twin Cities during the riots of George Floyd when tens of thousands of protesters took to the streets for days. However, it is at this point in time that we see how she has completely veered off course and must have seemingly forgot that her original or opening statement was that she planned to ask some budget questions about the cost of the Qatar plane, where the money for the Army's parade is coming from, or the National Guard deployments to the border and where that money's coming from. But I guess that's just it. She had planned to ask some questions as it relates to budget for these topics, but instead now she's just going to try her best to become an internet meme, using this time and opportunity to try and build some sort of prosecutory attack against Defense Secretary Hegseth about what's happening in Los Angeles and the recent deployment of U.S. Marines. A reference to us all seeing the continuous loops on live TV of protests that, as she says, looks nothing like George Floyd protests or Rodney King LA riots of 1992 doesn't actually help her case, as the media has intentionally and carefully selected these chosen loops for that very reason. But I digress. And let's press on and let her cook. Watch as she jumps out of the frying pan into the fire, and Pete Hegseth is just as cool as a fan and simply reminds her of the facts and perhaps some not so great memories that she has strategically chosen to forget.
History has proven that law enforcement and the National Guard are more than capable of handling situations more volatile than what happened this weekend. We all see the continuous loops on TV, but this looks nothing like the George Floyd protests or the Rodney King riots in Los Angeles in 1992. Mr. Secretary, this is a deeply unfair position to put our Marines in. Their service should be honored. It should not be exploited. The President has issued an executive order and talked about deploying troops across the country. Los Angeles County has 17,000 law enforcement personnel, and the state of California has 24,000 National Guard troops. So that's why the Los Angeles Chief Police to say, and I quote, "The possible arrival of federal military forces in Los Angeles is absent a clear coordination, presents a significant logistical operational challenge for those of us who are charged with safeguarding the city," the end of his quote. As I mentioned before, in Minnesota, we train for those things together. So there's no need for the Marines to be deployed.
Open and shut case. There's no need for the Marines to be deployed. Laughable. And so, Representative McCollum just reread some news article and headline, likely from CNN or the sort, quoting the LAPD police chief and just summing it all up by saying, well, this doesn't look like George Floyd or Rodney King, so history has proven law enforcement and the National Guard are more than capable of handling it. We don't need the Marines. Marines should be celebrated. But stick with me here, folks, because this is going to get really, really good here in just a moment. I'm surprised there isn't talk or repetitive rhetoric on legacy news yet about using the military against citizens. The irony of that scenario is that Biden actually authorized such use of armed forces, or at least Elizabeth Warren did with her use of the auto pen. But mainly now it would be such a bombshell drop onto the Dems, launched by themselves, since these protesters and some rioters are not actually U.S. citizens. Loophole. The total population of undocumented illegals is something like over 1 million in California, I believe. But, okay. After all this lead up, now Betty begins to ask her budget questions. And keep in mind how she phrased these questions and the time she used leading up to said budget questions.
So here are my budget questions, though. What is the current cost for what is taking place in California, and how is it going to affect this budget or the budget we're currently serving under? How much are these deployments going to cost for both the Marines and the National Guard? And what training or duties are not taking place because of these deployments? Where in your limited budget, sir, Are you going to find, in the remainder of this fiscal year, are you going to pull the money to cover these deployments? What holes are being created?
Well, Congresswoman, thank you for the question. You are right. We are both originally from Minnesota, which is why I recall 2020 quite well, when Governor Walz abandoned a police precinct and allowed it to be burned to the ground, and also allowed 5 days of chaos to occur inside the streets of Minneapolis. The police precinct, ma'am, was abandoned and burned to the ground. And because of that, the National Guard was eventually far too late mobilized. And President Trump recognizes a situation like that, improperly handled by a governor, like it was by Governor Walz, if it gets out of control, is a bad situation for the citizens of any location.
What's the current cost of what's taking place in California, and how's it going to affect this budget or the budget we're currently serving under? How much are these deployments going to cost for both the Marines and the National Guard? And where will Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth pull the money from to cover these deployments? Well, number one, correct me if I'm wrong, but you can't put a price on freedom. I mean, am I right? And B, the cost is negligible. If only the same concern was present in 2020, as both Betty McCollum and Pete Hegseth are originally from Minnesota, and our Secretary of Defense recalls the events quite well. As far as costs go, there should be consideration for not just budget, but opportunity costs as well. What was the cost of the loss of a police station that was burned to the ground, and the overall impacts resulting afterwards? Where are the bureaucratic bean counters and accountants at now, saying, well, it'll cost less to rebuild a police station than it will to deploy troops, the National Guard, Marines, or whatever? I mean, come on, guys. Tell me that doesn't make any sense. Because if it does, then we're obviously not on the same page here. However, as Defense Secretary Hegseth proceeds to provide answers to all the questions presented by Representative Betty McCollum, she then interrupts him. How rude. And this is the problem with the way these games are played inside the walls of the government buildings and within Congress. She didn't want the answer. These Democrats never do. Instead, she was hoping to get a rise out of the room and stun Pete Hegseth with this weak and failed attempt at a gotcha moment that absolutely blows up in her face. There's no justification for Governor Tim Walz and his abandonment of the Minnesota police precinct, period. And as a result of his poor leadership, the precinct was burned to the ground. We, the Trump administration, Defense Secretary Hegseth, MAGA, are not going to sit around and wait for our cities to be destroyed. No. And don't even get me started on the J6 Pelosi National Guard request. That's going to need its own video or its own live stream. President Trump's being the great commander that we all know and voted for, and he's protecting the citizens, regardless of their location. President Trump is not going to allow the LA anti-ICE protests and now riots in the streets to go on, improperly handled in a way that could only be described as worse than how Tim Walz mucked up in Minnesota 4 or 5 years ago. And meanwhile, Gavin Newsom says, hold my beer.
So in Los Angeles, we believe that ICE, which is a federal law enforcement agency, has the right to safely conduct operations in any state and any jurisdiction in the country, especially after 21 million illegals have crossed our border under the previous administration. ICE ought to be able to do its job, whether it's Minneapolis or Los Angeles.
I have limited time. I asked a budget
and they
question.
Are being,
Could the Secretary please address the budget? Thank you.
You asked about the situation in Los Angeles, and we believe ICE agents should be allowed to be safe in doing their operations, and we have deployed National Guard and the Marines to protect them in the execution of their duties, because we ought to be able to enforce immigration law in this country, unlike what Governor Walz did in 2020.
Betty McCollum is now trying to pivot to the budget question because she's afraid to admit that this is an immigration concern and not a budget problem. Where where was her concern for budget when Biden's open border policy allowed 21 million illegals to pour into our country and empty our wallets and bank accounts with blank checks and prepaid debit cards to cover their housing, shelter, food, and healthcare costs? But like I said, Hegseth, our Secretary of Defense, remains calm and collected, providing answers to the questions and ultimately shutting Betty McCollum down in what can only be described as a brutally humiliating spectacle that she brought on to herself and will be sure to light the entire internet on fire and go viral. Help! Share this video. I want everyone to see how she not only humiliated herself, but all Democrats and progressives alike.
There are 17,000 LAPD, you mentioned that. There would be 18,000 if not for the defund movement that folks like Gavin Newsom and Karen Bass have implemented. The police chief said she was overwhelmed,
If the Secretary's not
so we
going to
helped.
ask the budgetary questions, I will yield back my time if the Secretary refuses to answer the budgetary questions I put before him. They're important. What training missions aren't happening? Where are you pulling the money from? And how are you planning this in the moving forward? These are budget questions that affect this committee and the decisions we're going to be making in a couple of hours. If you're not going to answer them, please let the chairman know, and I will take back my time and I will yield it back to the chairman.
Mr. Secretary, I want to just let us know what accounts you're pulling the money to fund.
Thankfully, unlike the previous administration, we've got a 13% increase in our defense budget, and we will have the capability to cover down on contingencies,
Mr.
which is
Chairman,
something the National Guard and the Marine
I
plan for. So we have the funding to cover down on contingencies, especially ones as important as maintaining law and order in a major American city. As far as training, all of the units on the ground have been fully trained in their capabilities of what they're executing on the
Chairman,
ground.
ask for budgetary. If he needs to get back to the committee with the numbers, I'd appreciate it, both current and present.
Happy to
Thank
submit
you.
them for the record.
Gentlemen will receive an answer to the question for the record. Gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, again, welcome. As I mentioned in my opening